Right, well, why don't we go ahead and get started? Good afternoon, everyone. Dan Pearsall, I'm the Director of Development for the Coastal Land Trust, and we're so glad you're joining us today for our little lunch lecture. First, a little housekeeping. We are recording the lecture and we're streaming on Facebook Live today. So if you don't want your image in the video, please go ahead and turn your video off now. We are going to keep everybody on mute during the presentation, and at the end we'll have some time for you to unmute and ask some questions. Stephanie's going to place a few links in the chat for you to check out that will allow you to sign up for our e-news so you can stay in touch with us, view some of the past lunch lectures, and support the land conservation and education programs of the Coastal Land Trust. Now, we're so glad to have Ted Wilgis, the Senior Coastal Specialist for the North Carolina Coastal Federation, here with us to tell us a little bit about oyster farming along the coast. Ted joined the Federation in 1997, coming from the Chesapeake Bay Foundation, where he managed and developed education programs around the bay and a watershed planning initiative for the Nanticoke River. He leads the education program in the Federation's Southeast office, and he designs and implements oyster habitat restoration, living shoreline, and stormwater reduction projects. Previously, he served as the Cape Fear Coastkeeper for 5 years and as the Federation's education director. Ted holds a Bachelor's of Art in Zoology from the Connecticut College and a Coast Guard captain's license, and is currently enrolled in the Marine Biology Graduate Program at the University of North Carolina at Wilmington. Ted, welcome to the Little Lunch Lecture.
Thank you, Van. Thank you for the opportunity. I really appreciate the Coastal Land Trust doing these amazing lectures and being able to share a little bit about the work that the Coastal Federation is doing and lots of other people are doing with oysters. And thank you all for joining us today during lunch. Oysters are a suitable topic for those of you who like to eat them, and I hope you will still like to eat them after we talk a little bit about what makes them so interesting. So I've got a few slides to share with you. We'll be talking about not only the oyster farming, but why oysters are an important part of our coastal ecology and economy, as well as things we can do to become part of oyster restoration and enjoying oysters by eating them, but also enjoying the benefits they provide us. And there'll be a little bit of time at the end for some questions. So if you have anything, please let us know. So just a little bit about the Coastal Federation. Here, we're a nonprofit just like the Coastal Land Trust, and we've been able to partner. That's how we get our work done in North Carolina. We're very lucky that the conservation groups work really well together to provide really effective strategies, as well as collaborative efforts to work on a variety of projects. Specifically with the Coastal Land Trust, we were one of the organizations, along with the Land Trust in Audubon, North Carolina, and the Bird Island Preservation Society and others, that worked really hard to protect Bird Island down in Brunswick County off Sunset Beach. And once it was protected, there were issues that kept coming up. And again, these groups all worked together. And without that collaboration and the citizens down there, particularly Frank Neesmith, who's pictured right there, this would not have happened. So collaboration is key. And then Springer's Point, this beautiful area up on Cook Island that the Land Trust has worked with residents and others to preserve and keep open to the public. The Coastal Federation partnered with them to help protect the shoreline and some of the residents and volunteers to provide living shoreline benefits there. And again, all these different groups bring different expertise to the table. And so without this collaboration, we wouldn't be able to get done and protect and preserve our beautiful coast that we have here. So we really appreciate the opportunity to collaborate. So a little bit about oysters. They are an amazing animal. I know sometimes people look at an oyster and think, it's not that pretty, but I see oysters and they look very pretty to me. So it's one of those things. My daughter kind of looks at me crazy, but she also likes exploring with me. But they do a lot for us. They filter water, helping support good water quality. If you like to eat shrimp, crab, flounder, they provide very important fish habitat. They also do a tremendous amount in terms of our economy. The clean water they provide helps to support tourism, fishing, other industries along the coast. The oysters as food, support a commercial fishery, a recreational fishery, and a growing oyster farming, which we'll be talking about. But all those supporting jobs with restaurants and other folks are all supported by oysters. And a recent study has said that the oyster farming could grow to be a $100 million industry in North Carolina along the coast, and especially in some areas of the coast where there are economic challenges. Oyster farming could really fill a niche. So the potential for oysters is huge. They're vital to us in a number of ways, and they can be even more vital to us in the future. Oysters have always been important in North Carolina, both economically and socially and culturally. Native Americans would come down to the shore and camp along the shore and eat oysters and scallops and clams. They leave behind their piles, and those are archaeological sites, oyster shell middens today that we look at. When Europeans came to North Carolina, oysters were harvested. They were harvested by tongs, as you see in this one picture, by hand. And eventually, as technology grew, so did our ability to harvest. And the oyster dredging started up in the Northeast, up in Massachusetts. And the oyster dredging industry was so effective, it ended up moving all the way down the coast into North Carolina because they were essentially wiping out the oyster. They were so effective. In fact, in 1872, North Carolina hired Admiral Winslow to map all the oyster reefs in North Carolina. And that one map, the Winslow map there, is of the map of the oysters that were in the Cape Fear River back in 1872. So there were huge reefs. We estimate that we might have anywhere from 10 to 20% of those reefs left in North Carolina. So we've lost anywhere from 90 to 80% of oysters, of our oyster habitat in North Carolina, unfortunately. And this is a very busy chart. I apologize. Just if you focus on one end down by the zero, in 1880 and 1889, that's when the dredgers came in, basically, and we saw a peak unsustainable oyster harvest, 800,000 bushels in 1 year. And then it declined, and currently it's probably the commercial fishery is anywhere from 80 to 100,000 bushels. But there's been a lot of different effects on oysters. There's been diseases, red tides, different types of harvest pressure, water quality declines, storms, all sorts of things have affected oysters. There's also been regulation, management, and restoration efforts. So the bottom line is oysters are really important, but they are under great stress, and we've lost a lot of oysters. So we need to do everything we can to bring oysters back. One of the big things we need is good water quality. Oysters can survive in a variety of water quality, but they do need good water quality, and we need excellent water quality to be able to harvest and eat them. So if we want to have a thriving oyster industry, an oyster habitat, and oyster farming, we have to make sure that we're protecting our water quality through a variety of methods. Things like what the Land Trust does with land protection, what the Coastal Federation does with water quality restoration, and other groups are a key part of bringing oysters back in North Carolina. And what's happened, along the coast, we've seen a changing landscape. This is Howe Creek down in New Hanover County in 1984, and in 2000, the landscape has changed. And this is not to say that development is bad, but what we can do is, as we develop using low impact development techniques, we can promote the changes to get water when it rains into the ground instead of running off. Before land is developed, you might have 10% runoff when it rains. The rest of the water is either infiltrated into the ground or evaporated, transpired. Once you have traditional runoff, traditional development, that runoff increases to 55%. So all of a sudden, all that storm water is entering our coastal waters where our oysters live, where we fish and recreate. And you start to see these red closures on these creeks. These are the creeks in New Hanover County, again, down here. All that red basically means those areas are closed or prohibited to shellfish harvesting due to stormwater pollution carrying harmful bacteria into our creeks. And if you go back the slide, that red up and down the coast are all those areas that are closed. So we have all these amazing waters, but we're seeing more and more closures. And so thinking smartly, using a variety of strategies to protect our coast, at the same time allow the development, economic development that comes with it, is one of the strategies we have to move toward. In 1983, the Coastal Federation worked with a lot of other stakeholders to develop what's called the Oyster Blueprint. And the unique thing about the blueprint was it didn't just look at water quality by itself, or building oyster reefs, or research by itself. It linked all those together in a concrete plan that could take multiple stakeholders could implement over time. And so you're looking at restoring water quality, managing oysters, restoring oysters, building oyster farming, looking at research, develop oyster strains through the UNCW hatchery. All those things combined to bring back oysters, because we can put as much shell and build oyster reefs as we can, but if we don't have good water quality and the other things and good management, then we will not see the gains that we have to. Some of the things that are being done in North Carolina to restore oyster habitat are building sanctuaries. These are areas that are built usually in the deeper part of the water of the coast, up into the Pamlico Sound. And these are areas that are large sanctuaries, many acres, 12 to 50 acres in size, in water that's 8 to 12 feet deep, and you're building these big mounds. Once you get down below Jacksonville in North Carolina, our oyster habitat kind of changes from that deep subtidal area to shallow intertidal. So you have a different type of habitat, and that carries forth down into Florida. And so down here, we employ methods working with the Division of Marine Fisheries called Cultch planting. And that's where you put oyster shell on barges and put it over in shallow areas and form these low reefs that are maybe 6 inches, 4 inches high. And when you're working with oysters are, they're mass spawners. So you have a reef, and in the springtime when the water temperature gets a little bit warmer, the oysters spawn. And they spawn, the males release sperm, the females release eggs. You have this fertilized egg in the water for about 3 weeks. That egg then develops a foot, and it has the ability to detect light. So at that point, it's tiny. You can fit a million of these larvae, which are called petaveloger, which basically means swimming foot, in the palm of your hand. And they're swimming around on the surface. And all of a sudden, they can detect light. And they're like, nope, we don't like light. We want to get down to the bottom. They swim down the bottom, and they attach to something hard, preferably another oyster. So without that oyster reef, that's that base layer of the reef, the oyster larvae will not survive. In North Carolina, we're very lucky in the sense that in most areas, if we just put oyster shell or crushed concrete or other suitable material for the base of an oyster reef, there's enough natural population that the oyster larvae can find that reef and grow. Other states, you actually have to supplement that shell with larvae attached to it, which is a complex and expensive process. And so we're doing a lot of things to bring back oysters, ranging from water quality to building reefs. But we're also looking at farming. There's a well-known food writer named Rowan Jacobson, and he wrote a book. One of his early books was all about oysters, and he traveled all around the country, Gulf Coast, the East Coast, the West Coast, looking at oysters. He wrote about the different tastes in each coast. There was no chapter in that book on North Carolina. So we invited him down to one of our oyster meetings, and he said, look, you all have amazing waters. And he coined the phrase, you all could be the Napa Valley of oysters. And that along with a lot of other things, galvanized the stakeholders in North Carolina to look at what can we do to really grow and promote oyster farming. And so we started the Shellfish Initiative, which is recognized nationally and can bring a lot of resources from federal government to the state, working with state government and the stakeholders involved in the Oyster Blueprint. And oyster farming is growing. North Carolina is a public trust state, so if you want to grow oysters in our waters, you have to lease the water, either the water column, which means the water surface down to the bottom, or you lease the actual estuarine bottom. So you have to lease that from the state. Basically, in 2018 and in current years, we're seeing lease applications anywhere from 50 to 60 a year. Previously, we were seeing about 6 a year. There's been a dramatic change and evolution with how we are doing. The Division of Marine Fisheries, state agency, is processing leasing. training for farmers. There's a whole range of things that's happening to help farmers get into the industry. And the North Carolina General Assembly directed the UNC Collaboratory to develop a shellfish plan. And they came up with a series of recommendations. They range from regulatory to statutory, looking at things where we could do shellfish enterprise zones, where you could essentially set up an area where farmers could learn how to grow oysters without encouraging all the risk. Farmers need support, just like a soybean farmer, a tobacco farmer, sweet potato farmer, low interest loans, crop insurance, those kind of things. Shellfish farmers don't have access to some of those things, or they're not keeping in step with the way the industry is growing. Research. UNCW has a great shellfish hatchery. There's a lot of other things being done with Sea Grant and others that could really support the industry. And really promoting. You used to go into an oyster restaurant in North Carolina and they would have Stump Sound, Pamlico, and then 14 others from Virginia, Louisiana. Now you go into an oyster bar and you see Whiskey Creek, Slash Creek. You see the actual creek because people are really connecting with that oyster farmer that is right down the road and is developing their oyster based on what that unique niche that they're growing in. And of course, water quality. So these are the actions that we're moving forward with oyster farming. These are just some photos of different types of oyster farming. Again, you have that kind of water column, and that's where you're growing oysters in cages near the surface of the water. And that's, they get a lot of light, they get a lot of oxygen, and what they like to eat, they're filter feeders. So they like to eat plankton. So all the food, oxygen is right there to the surface. It's kind of like if you were living at a buffet, 24 hours a day, 365 days a year, you're right there, and you just get fat and plump and you're good to go. That's what the oysters are doing in these cages. And so the farmers are growing oysters to market size within 16 months, where usually an oyster to get to 3 inches, which is a market size or shuckable size, might take 3 years. Now they're using oysters, don't want to get too scientific, but they're using oysters called triploid oysters, which means they have an extra chromosome, which means they don't reproduce. So the old adage of only eating oysters during the R months has basically gone out the window for a number of reasons. One is if you're eating farmed oysters, used to be it was cold, and so there's real concern that if you eat oysters, especially in the South during warmer months, there's potential for different diseases and pathogens to be there, which are almost always there, but during warmer months, they become in such high levels that they can be dangerous. But now with improvement in refrigeration, transport, et cetera, that's not as much of an issue. And then with oyster farmers, since they're growing these triploid oysters, the oysters that are normally reproducing during the summer, and they don't taste very good, they're putting all their energy into reproducing, they aren't doing that anymore. So an oyster farmer can harvest an oyster between June and September, and that oyster is still going to be fat and plump and juicy. And so now we have a year-round market. We don't have to go to Louisiana and other states to get our oysters during the summer, our restaurants and markets. And so that's a big change. And that's one of the things that's allowed the industry to grow. And so you have these surface operations. You also have bottom cages. These are cages that you grow right on the bottom. Different techniques, different type of oyster, different tastes and shapes. And so a lot of people think, well, this must be different species because it looks totally different. All the same oyster. We just grow one commercial viable oyster in North Carolina. You go out to Seattle and you go to an oyster bar and you might have 4 or 5 different species. Here we just have one species, but they take on all different shapes and forms and taste based on where they come from. The oysters have also seen, because we're growing so fast, there's also concerns. If you have a house on the shoreline, do you want to look out and see this in front of your house? Some people may not care. Some people may be concerned about that. And so one of the things the oyster shellfish plan is trying to look at areas where we can lessen user conflict between landowners, homeowners, other fishers, utilization, recreation, other things. And so that you're promoting good practices with oyster farming, you're promoting ways to reduce user conflict and address some of the concerns that other people have who may not be as interested in oyster farming. So we're trying to look at other states and learn from and take their lessons learned, be proactive. And so if you have oyster farms in your neck of the woods and you're either concerned or interested, there's a lot of resources out there for you. And I'll share those at the end. So again, this is just talks about the different types of gear. Oyster farming can do lots of benefit. They reduce the pressure on the wild oysters. Oyster farms can do some of the same things that natural oysters do with oyster filtration, providing habitat. You have other organisms using the structures as homes. You can also you can improve water quality. Some oyster farmers are seeing blooms of underwater vegetation, which are really important. And so there's potential benefits. There's also some concerns which are being looked at. And so as oyster farming grows in the state, there's a lot of things that we're doing to look at and make sure we do it well. Again, this is what we're looking at. This is Stump Sound behind Topsail Island. The green areas are areas that are approved for harvest. And so Stump Sound we have a lot of wonderful oysters. It's world famous for oysters. And we're trying to protect that water quality because what we're seeing are increasing closures due to stormwater pollution. These are leases that are in Stump Sound, and this is dated. There are even more leases there now. This has one of the highest concentration of leases in the state. And so the Coastal Federation, we were lucky, we just received a grant to do a watershed restoration plan. So one of the things we'll be looking at is how can we, as the growth continues in Stump Sound, how can we protect the water quality, allow that growth, but protect the water quality to support wild and farmed oysters. These are just some resources that are out there for you. There's a new oyster trail in North Carolina. So if you own a restaurant or if you're an oyster farmer or you want to go visit, take a tour or eat local oysters, you can go to this website, ncyoysters.org, and you can check out places on the oyster trail. The Division of Marine Fisheries has a website you can go to, and you can click on that and find all the oyster leases in your neck of the woods if you want to find out what leases are. There's a whole slew of resources there for training if you're interested in becoming an oyster farmer. And then next week, our Department of Cultural Resources has Oyster Week because oyster season opens on the 15th. And so there's a whole series that they're doing, and you can check out that on their website as well. One thing I forgot to mention, we also have oyster shell recycling in North Carolina, and you can find that on our website, nccoast.org. If you do eat oysters, we encourage you to recycle them by getting them back so that we can get them back in the water. So I think I went a little bit over, I apologize, but again, just a quick snapshot. There's a lot more resources out there, and welcome you to contact us or any of the other stakeholders who are engaged in this. But oysters are great to eat. They're great for our coast. They're great for our economy. So I appreciate your attention and time. Thank you all very much.
Hey, Ted, thanks so much. That's really amazing. I know I had always stuck with the only eat them in the months that end R. So it's kind of neat to know that I can get them anytime I want now. So I love them. I think oysters are a lot like licorice. Either you love them or you do not. There's no really area there. But let's take a chance. If anyone has any questions, feel free to go ahead and you can use the chat. You can unmute yourself and ask Ted directly. And if you're on Facebook, just put your message or your question in the comment section and we'll get it read for you. So
Ted, I have a question. Why are Stump Sound oysters so special and so good?
It's an amazing estuary. It's shallow. It's incredibly rich, and it gets what some people think are the perfect blend of fresh and salt water. It's relatively undeveloped, and so it's got really good water quality. It's outstanding resource water. The oysters there, the wild oysters, tend to grow very slowly, so they're very, very they're meaty. Their shells are thick. The farmed oysters there have that same kind of taste, and so it's a unique taste, and people love it.
Hey, Ted. I've got a question. This is Peter. I'm actually here from Tallahassee, Florida. So I know it's a little bit different down here in Apalachicola. We just shut down our oyster fishery in Apalachicola. And one of the things that I'm interested in is the relationship between wild oysters and advocacy for those wild oysters and the oyster farming industry. Because if they're raising triploid and it's not necessarily contributing, what is the relationship between those people farming and advocating for the protection of wild oysters if they're not harvesting those wild oysters? Could you just expand on that a little bit?
Yeah, Peter, we've been lucky in North Carolina in that, you know, all these stakeholders have kind of been working together for a while. And so we have oyster farmers and wild harvesters basically supporting each other. The wild harvesters, you know, they like the oyster farmers. The oyster farmers provide a niche. You know, they've a shucking market. It's a very high dollar market. And some people are willing to pay $2, $3 an oyster. Some people don't. They want a bushel of oysters for $30. And so, you know, they're each finding their niches, but they all rely on good water quality. They all rely on a very vibrant market. And so, you know, it used to be very hard to find North Carolina oysters. Like if you were going to a restaurant in Raleigh, Durham, it was very hard. It was harder. It was easier to find a Louisiana or Chesapeake Bay oyster than a North Carolina oyster. And so I think they're all excited about working together for the market and expanding the market in the niche of North Carolina, not only in the state, but also getting up into New York and other areas across the country. So water quality, some of the regulations that are being, that affect them, they see kind of the ability to work together. There hasn't been much conflict in terms of resources. The state's still providing Cultch planting, which supports the wild harvest. Same time, the state is devoting a lot of effort towards looking at promotion, you know, updating the regulations for oyster farming. So they've worked pretty well hand in hand. There are areas, though, that you know, some people are concerned. There's moratoriums, like in Brunswick County. Some counties have to have moratoriums on leases because people are concerned that oyster farms are taking up good growing oyster bottom. And so there are those areas of conflict. But so far, I think, you know, through kind of trying to be proactive and taking lessons learned, we're trying to manage that pretty well. So we've been lucky. We haven't seen some of the divergent kind of trails that other states have.
But I'm going to ask you the question that every oyster eater on here wants to know. What's your favorite?
Oh gosh. I love them all. You know, I don't eat them as much as I used to. Unfortunately, you know, it's one of those things where I love oysters, but after you spend so much time with them, you're like, okay, I need some French fries today. You know, I love them. I'm particularly, yeah, I love the stump sound oysters too. I love the estuary. I've got the mud between my toes, it seems like, and you know, I love them. So I love those stump sound oysters. They're a mix of intertidal and subtidal.
Yeah, we were lucky enough to get some from UNCW for an event we did one year, and they were the most amazing oysters I think I've ever had. You know, just nice and salty and juicy, just incredible. So if there are no other questions for Ted, I want to thank you guys again for coming out and joining us for a little lunch lecture. There will be in the chat a link where you can go and check out all the past lectures and what's coming up. And we have some great programs coming up. So this is your first time joining us. I hope it won't be your last. October 16th, we've got Mavis Gregg from the American Forest Foundation, who will speak on heirs property. October 23rd, we are working hard to find someone to fill that spot. So stay tuned and keep apprised of what's going to happen there. October the 30th, we've got John Carpenter from the North Carolina Wildlife Resources Commission, who's going to talk about red-cockaded woodpeckers. And then on November 6th, we've got our board member, Sam Cook from NC State, who's going to speak about the College of Natural Resources and provide a brief overview of the management strategies for each of NC State's 10 properties with a focus on Hoffman Forest. So if you like the little lunch lectures, we hope that you will support the Coastal Land Trust for more programs like this. Stephanie will drop the link for that in the chat as well. And I just want to thank everybody for being here. Today is Leif Erikson Day, so get out this weekend and explore somewhere new. Enjoy the rest of your day and have a great weekend. We'll see you next week. Goodbye.
Thank you, Ted.
Thank you all. Bye-bye.
Thanks, Ted. Appreciate it. Good
Thanks.
job. Lots of the comments said that everyone's ready for oysters for lunch.
Oh, great.
Ready to go. Get some.
Well, thank
Nice
you all.
job, Ted. Thank you so much.
Appreciate the invitation.
Bye.
Bye-bye.
Bye.
Bye.